I really appreciate you all being here and engaging in this conversation with us. Everyone say conversation.
Conversation.
That means that we expect you to be active participants. Yeah, the kindergarten teacher is going to continue to come through. And before we get any further, can you all give a round of applause to the staff who have enabled us to be in this space? Thank you all for all that you do. We were both introduced. I want to make sure that we're good stewards of the time, so I'm going to jump into it. But in this moment, before we start this conversation, I want to acknowledge how appropriate it is that the ancestors conspired for us to be here on the birthday of one of my favorite people. Many of you know, some of you acknowledge in this moment, I'm wearing a shirt that recognizes him as well, but this would have been James Baldwin, Uncle Jimmy, his 100th birthday. How about that? How about that? I was super excited to make this happen on today. And very much related to this, I want to share a piece of his that is very relevant to this book, this gift that Brian Rashad Fuller has offered to us, and it is his A Talk to Teachers. So Uncle Jimmy offered this up to us on October 16, 1963. This was 37 days before the assassination of JFK. I'm sharing these dates because of the sociologists. I know some of us think about life markers. I remember 9/11, I'll never forget it. Some of y'all thought about where you were when I said the assassination of JFK. I encourage you all to read this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are these 3 points that Uncle Jimmy makes that I'm going to share with you, and then I want to invite you to talk about what Uncle Jimmy means to you. And I'm doing that in part because he quotes Uncle Jimmy. So I know that there are already connections here that are relevant to what we're going to talk about today. The first thing that Uncle Jimmy talks about in this, again, A Talk to Teachers, and he starts by saying, and I quote, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country." If he were alive in this moment, I think he would also add woke to that. He goes on to say that to any citizen of this country who figures, he says himself, and I want to say themselves to be as inclusive as possible, themselves as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. We must understand the importance of determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. So this for me is a reminder that, as Bell Hooks talks about, democracies have to be defended with each generation. And in this moment, there's no point to us pretending that we are not in a war for our democracy, or the soul of our country, or the ability to make sure that brilliant babies like this one are able to thrive. He talks about that. The second thing that he talks about is the importance of remaining future focused, or what I think about when I think about Afrofuturism, imagining a life in a world where white supremacy doesn't taint everything that we experience. He specifically says that it's important for us to understand the importance of carrying a vision. I'm gonna come back to that. Okay. All right, see where I'm going. And then the last thing that he says for me is that it is the responsibility of educators, and I'm gonna expand this to caring and concerned adults of all stripes. I acknowledge, as a former classroom teacher, I taught kindergarten and 3rd grade. I teach college now. I spent 10 years working in the Senate. That's like managing a kindergarten classroom. Right? What Uncle Jimmy talks about is that it is the responsibility of educators to understand that teaching is political, and that as such, their job is to make sure that they support young people in being critical thinkers, so that at some point they can be autonomous beings who are able to thrive. And he names again this paradox of our social order and public schools generally in America claiming to want to support autonomous beings, but actually wanting people to fall in line and do things that real machines do. And all of this is going to come up in the course of this conversation. Y'all can hold me accountable to that. Acknowledging the foundation provided by Uncle Jimmy, who is one of our nation's heroes, a witness, a race warrior, someone who we should continue to apply the lessons that he shared. What does he mean to you, and why did you decide to include him as meaningfully as you did in your book?
Awesome. Well, first I just want to thank everyone for being here, and also thank you, Dr. David Johns, for
moderating this conversation with me. I really appreciate you. And I agree. I think the ancestors conspired for us to be here today. James Baldwin, he is the most quoted. So each chapter of the book, I start with a quote from someone who has done this work, has been in this work before I have been in this work. And James Baldwin is one of the people that are most quoted within this book in each chapter. And so the reason that I did that was specifically for what Dr. Johns brought up was I talked to teachers. That for me, I think James Baldwin was a brilliant visionary, as we talked about, but also too, what he did in a talk to teachers that is often referenced a lot. It was 1963 at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. He humanized the experience of Black children, right? Black children in the classroom, Black children in this country, in a way that I think moved definitely those in the room when he gave the talk, but now have continued to move us to action and have inspired books, inspired teachings, and have done so much. And so for me, it was so important to acknowledge him and acknowledge his work in my work because it was so formative for my work. It was so influential for my work. And also this point around critical consciousness and the paradox of education. James Baldwin talks about as you start to, and I have a quote in here in my book, and I talk about it, I quote that the paradox of education is as you start to become conscious, as you get older, you start to become at war with your society, right? Because you realize, and I go into this in the book, that the society is at war with you, as a black and brown person. And so for me, I think when I think about being Black in American schools and the way that we educate Black and brown children in this country and the designs of the schools and how it perpetuates this social, racial caste system that exists within America, I think that idea of critical consciousness and understanding that as a Black person, as a Black human in this country, and as you become conscious of what's happening around you, you realize that this society is at war with you, and then therefore you become at war with it. And you need to, and as an educated person, it's up to us to be critical of that society. And so James Baldwin was a huge influence to me. So proud. It's his 100th birthday, and I thank Dr. Johns for starting that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Hey, feel free to call me David. What I typically say is that Black people call me David, but my personal form of reparations is that white people are obligated to call me Doctor. So I want to name chapter 2, A Terrible Way, and the quote used because it matters is children not yet aware that it is dangerous to look too deeply at anything, look at everything, and draw their own conclusions. A Black child looking at the world around them might change, though they might change, cannot know quite what to make of it, is aware that there's a reason why their mother works so hard, why their father is always on edge. They are aware that there is some terrible weight on their parents' shoulders, which menaces them. It isn't long, in fact. It begins when they are in school, before they discover the shape of their oppression. So before we get into painting this picture of the shape of oppression, which some people are going to be more familiar with than others, I want to stay in the space of freedom dreaming. So imagine with me for a second, we're sitting in this space, it's 2050. What do public schools look, feel, and function like, and how do Black students experience them?
Wow, that's a great question. So first, I'll talk about the experience piece and then go back to the other elements. So in 2050, in the ideal world, how Black children would experience our public education system.